They say Victor Calloway never runs. He walks into boardrooms and makes men sweat. He drives through the South Side and the streets go quiet. He stares down cops and federal agents alike, and not one of them has ever made him blink. But tonight, Victor Calloway is running. Down a hospital corridor, past crashing gurneys and screaming nurses, toward a room where a woman who scrubbed his floors and ironed his shirts is bleeding out on a table. And the only thing standing between her and the next bullet is him. She saved his life. Now the question is whether he's already too late to save hers. If this story already has you gripped, hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Follow along, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about loyalty, power, and the people nobody ever bothers to look at twice. The bomb was real. That was the part Victor Calloway kept coming back to, 4 hours after the fact, sitting in the back of a replacement SUV with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, watching Chicago blur past the rain-streaked window. The bomb was real. His security chief had planted it, and the person who had stopped him from driving straight into his own death was a 31-year-old housekeeper named Emily Parker, who made $11 an hour and took 2 buses to get to work every morning. He didn't know she took 2 buses. He realized that now, which bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Dominic Reyes, his head of personal security, a compact, gray-templed man who had worked for Victor for 11 years, sat across from him in the vehicle's rear compartment and said nothing. Dominic understood when silence was the correct response. It was one of the things that had kept him alive this long. The rain picked up. Victor looked at his hands. He had shaken 10,000 hands in this city. Politicians, judges, union bosses, rival operators who came to him with their hats in their hands. And not one of those handshakes had ever felt as significant as the moment Emily Parker had grabbed his arm in the mansion foyer 2 hours ago, her face white as paper, her voice steady in a way that didn't match the terror in her eyes, and said, "Don't get in the car." He hadn't listened at first. That was the other part he kept coming back to. The Calloway mansion sat on the northern edge of Lincoln Park, a 4-story limestone structure that Victor's father had purchased in 1987 when the neighborhood was still transitional and the price still reasonable. The old man had renovated it twice, installed a security perimeter that would embarrass most government facilities, and then died of a heart attack at 62 before he could properly enjoy it. Victor had inherited both the house and the organization at 28, and in the 17 years since, he had transformed what his father built into something his father would not have entirely recognized: leaner, quieter, and considerably more dangerous. The staff numbered 14. 14 people who moved through the mansion's rooms and corridors on a rotating schedule, maintaining the appearance of a wealthy private household, while the actual business of the Calloway organization was conducted in offices and warehouses and restaurants throughout the city. Victor knew each of them by name. He knew their schedules, their performance records, their reliability ratings as assessed by Dominic. What he did not know, and this gap now felt significant in a way it hadn't before, was very much about who they actually were. Emily Parker had been hired 3 years ago. Dominic had pulled her application from a stack of 47. She had 3 part-time jobs at the time: cleaning offices downtown, cashiering at a grocery in Pilsen, and babysitting on weekends for a family in Wicker Park. She had no criminal record, no debt beyond a manageable student loan from a community college she had attended for 2 semesters before dropping out, and no family connections to any organization that would create a conflict. She was by every metric Dominic used a zero-risk hire. Victor had approved her without reading past the first line of the summary. He thought about that now, too. The morning had started the way most of his mornings started: early, cold, and already behind schedule. Victor was at his desk by 6, working through the overnight reports his network had generated. There were 3 items of note: a shipment delay out of the port that would require a conversation with the harbor master, a territorial dispute in Bridgeport that 2 of his lieutenants had failed to resolve, and an intelligence memo suggesting that a federal task force was sniffing around the edges of one of his legitimate holdings in the West Loop. None of it was crisis level. All of it required attention. He scheduled 4 calls before 9 and ate breakfast at his desk, which was a habit his doctor had told him 3 times to stop, and which he had no intention of stopping. Marcus Reed arrived at 7:15, as he did every morning. Marcus had been with the Calloway organization for 9 years. He had started as muscle, the kind of work that required a specific combination of size, discipline, and a certain vacancy behind the eyes that allowed a man to do what was necessary without taking too much of it home. But Marcus was smarter than he looked, and Victor had recognized it early. He had moved him through operations, through logistics, through 3 years running street-level enforcement before elevating him to security chief 2 years ago. The position came with an office, a salary that would have impressed a corporate VP, and direct access to Victor at any hour. Marcus used that access carefully and well, or so Victor had believed. That morning, Marcus entered the study with a leather portfolio and a cup of coffee he'd picked up from the kitchen, set both on the corner of Victor's desk, and ran through the day's security briefings with the same flat competence he brought to everything. 2 additional agents assigned to the evening event. A route change for the afternoon meeting, citing construction near the expressway. A reminder that the armored SUV had been serviced overnight and was ready in the garage. Victor had nodded through all of it. He'd asked 2 questions, both logistical. Marcus answered them and left. At no point did Marcus Reed look like a man who had spent the previous night overseeing the installation of a bomb in his employer's vehicle. Victor turned that over in his mind now, studying it the way you study a painting that looks normal until you notice the thing in the background that shouldn't be there. He had spent 17 years in a business that required him to read people accurately, and Marcus had sat in his study and lied to his face, and Victor had felt nothing. No flicker, no instinct, nothing. That bothered him more than the bomb. Emily Parker's shift started at 7 and ran until 3. She worked the main floor, the foyer, the formal rooms, the kitchen corridor, the dining room, alongside another housekeeper named Rosa, who had been with the mansion for 6 years, and who Emily, in Dominic's quiet assessment, had become genuinely friendly with. Rosa described Emily as reliable, private, and possessed of a quality that Rosa called seeing things, not in any mystical sense, but in the simple practical sense that Emily noticed when something was out of place, remembered where things belonged, and had a spatial memory for the mansion's routines that other staff found impressive. What Rosa did not know, and what Emily had never told anyone, was that 3 years of working in the Calloway mansion had given Emily Parker an education she hadn't signed up for. She had learned it the way you learn anything when you're invisible, gradually, accidentally, through proximity and patience. She had learned that the mansion's underground garage connected to a service tunnel that ran beneath the east garden. She had learned that certain conversations happen in certain rooms because the configuration of the walls made monitoring difficult. She had learned to recognize, by tone and body language alone, the difference between the men who came to the mansion for routine business and the men who came because something had gone wrong. She had learned, over the course of 3 years, the rhythms and temperatures of the Calloway organization, the way a person learns the rhythms of a house they've lived in long enough, not through study, but through accumulated sensation. She had learned which men were dangerous and which men were frightened. She had learned that Marcus Reed was both. The conversation she overheard happened at 6:50 in the morning, 40 minutes before Marcus arrived in Victor's study with his leather portfolio and his borrowed cup of coffee. Emily had arrived early. She sometimes did, when the buses ran ahead of schedule and the alternative was standing outside in the cold. She had let herself in through the service entrance, logged her arrival with the security desk, and gone downstairs to the basement laundry room to start a load before her official shift began. It was routine. Nobody paid attention to it. The underground garage was accessible from the basement through a heavy fire door that was supposed to be locked between midnight and 7. That morning, the door was not locked. Emily noticed because she noticed things, and because the gap between the door and the frame was slightly wider than it should have been, and because the light inside the garage, motion-activated, industrial fluorescent, was on. She didn't push the door open. She put her hand against it, felt the slight vibration of voices, and stopped. She knew, even then, that she should walk away. She didn't. Through the gap, she could see a slice of the garage interior, polished concrete floor, the edge of the armored SUV, and the partial silhouette of a man crouching near the vehicle's undercarriage. A second man stood a few feet back, arms folded, speaking in a low, deliberate voice. The crouching man's face was obscured. The standing man's face was not. Marcus Reed said, "Is it set?" The crouching man, Young, Tyler Brooks. She would place him later. One of the night shift security guards she'd seen twice in the kitchen said, "Yeah, remote detonation, clean, soon as the ignition sequence completes the second cycle." Marcus said, "No traces." Brooks said, "None." Marcus said, "Make sure you're off the property by 6:30. A pause. "If it works the way it's supposed to, nobody's going to be looking very hard at what happened in this garage. They're going to be looking at a crater." Brooks stood up. His hands were empty now. Whatever he had been doing beneath the vehicle was done. Emily pressed herself against the wall. She could not breathe properly. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way that she had never been aware of it before. Loud, uneven, too close to the surface. She stood there for approximately 4 minutes after the voices stopped and the lights clicked off. Then she went back upstairs, sat in the laundry room, and stared at the wall. She had 2 hours before Victor Calloway would get into that vehicle. The question was not whether she believed what she had heard. She believed it completely, with a certainty that sat in her chest like something physical. The question, the one she turned over and over in the laundry room while the washing machine ran its cycle and the basement stayed quiet, was what she was going to do about it. The rational answer, the safe answer, the answer that any sensible person operating in any sensible situation would arrive at, was nothing. She was a housekeeper. She made $11 an hour. She had a mother in Pilsen with a bad hip and a younger brother at community college and an apartment with a radiator that made noises she'd been ignoring for 2 winters. She had no standing in this world, no leverage, no protection. She also knew what Marcus Reed was capable of, because 3 years in this mansion had taught her that too. If she said something and Marcus found out before anything could happen to him, she would not survive the week. She was almost certain of that. She was completely certain that no one would be looking for her with any particular urgency if she disappeared. A woman like her, from a neighborhood like hers, working a job like this one. People disappeared all the time. The city absorbed them. She thought about her mother, her brother, the radiator. She thought about Victor Calloway getting into that SUV. The thing about 3 years of watching people, really watching them, the way you watch when nobody knows you're there, is that you accumulate more than information. You accumulate something harder to name. She had watched Victor Calloway conduct business she didn't entirely understand and wouldn't have approved of in another life. She had watched him be cold, methodical, and occasionally frightening. She had watched him bark at his security detail and ignore his staff, and move through his own house, like a man who had forgotten that the rooms were inhabited by other people. She had also watched him once spend 40 minutes on a phone call with a woman who turned out to be his younger sister, whose husband had just left her, and whose voice, audible even from across the room, thin and fracturing, had made Victor Calloway put down every piece of paper on his desk and just listen. Not talk, just listen, for 40 minutes, until his sister ran out of things to say. Emily didn't think that was the whole story of Victor Calloway. She didn't think anyone was the whole story. But it was a piece of one. And it was the piece she was holding when she stood up from the laundry room floor, smoothed her uniform, and walked upstairs to do the most dangerous thing she had ever done in her life. She found him in the foyer at 8:53. She knew it was 8:53 because she had checked the clock in the kitchen 3 times on the way, as if the time mattered, as if having the number fixed in her mind gave her something to hold on to. Victor was moving toward the front door with the particular velocity of a man who has his day fully mapped and expects no interference. He was in a dark suit, tie already in place, phone in hand, 2 members of his security team a step behind him. He did not look at Emily when she appeared in the foyer. She was furniture to him in that moment. She was the floor. She said, "Mr. Calloway." He didn't stop. She stepped directly into his path. He stopped. He looked at her. The security team looked at her. The room temperature dropped approximately 10 degrees. Victor said, "Move." Emily said, "Don't get in the car." Silence. Victor's expression did not change. That was more frightening than if it had. He had the face of a man who had learned a long time ago how to make his face say nothing at all, and he was using that face on her now with a completeness that made her knees want to quit. She held. She said, "There's a bomb in the SUV. I heard them. Marcus Reed and one of the night guards. In the garage this morning, before 6:30. The guard put something under the vehicle. Marcus said remote detonation. He said it was set for when the ignition... Stop. His voice was very quiet. That was worse than if he'd shouted. He said, "Say that again." She said it again. All of it. She kept her voice level and her eyes on his face, and she told him exactly what she had heard and exactly when she had heard it, and while she talked, she watched his expression do something she had not seen it do before. It didn't crack exactly, but something shifted behind it, some internal arrangement of certainties that had been fixed for a long time quietly rearranging themselves. When she finished, he looked at the security agent on his left, not Dominic, a younger man named Garrett, and said very calmly, "Get the dogs on the SUV, now, and find Marcus." Garrett moved. Victor looked back at Emily. He said, "You're sure?" She said, "Yes." He said, "You understand what happens to you if you're making this up?" She said, "I'm not making it up." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. She counted. Then he nodded, once, with the finality of a man closing a door, and walked back into the house. The bomb was real. The sweep team found it 11 minutes later, a compact device affixed to the chassis, sophisticated enough that 2 of the 3 agents examining the vehicle initially missed it. The third one found it because he was lying flat on the concrete and happened to angle his flashlight in a direction the others hadn't. He called it in without moving, without raising his voice, with the careful stillness of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. Victor was standing in the underground garage watching when the call came through. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, to Dominic, who had materialized at his elbow sometime in the previous 4 minutes, "Where's Marcus?" Dominic said, "Gone. Car left the property at 6:28 this morning, before the sweep." He knew. He knew. Victor looked at the vehicle. He looked at the device. Still in situ, the disposal team not yet arrived. A carefully engineered piece of metal and wire that represented in its compact and terrible way a level of planning and deliberate intent that you did not arrive at impulsively. Someone had spent time on this. Someone had resources. Someone had access. He said, "Find Tyler Brooks, already in motion, and Emily Parker." Dominic paused, just slightly, just long enough to register the unusual nature of the instruction, and said, "I'll see to it personally." Emily was in the kitchen when Dominic found her. She had gone back to work. She genuinely hadn't known what else to do. The rational part of her mind had understood that things were happening rapidly in other parts of the mansion, and that the correct response was probably to wait somewhere and let events develop. But she was a person who dealt with stress by moving, and the kitchen needed to be prepped for lunch, and so she was prepping it. Dominic stood in the kitchen doorway. He was a compact man with gray-streaked hair and an economy of movement that Emily had always found faintly unnerving. The way he took up exactly the space he needed and no more, and watched everything with a quietness that felt less like patience and more like calculation. He said, "He wants to see you." Emily set down the knife she was holding. She wiped her hands on a kitchen cloth. She said, "Is he angry?" Dominic considered the question with more care than it probably warranted. He said, "He's processing." "That's not a no." "No," Dominic said, "it's not." Victor was in his study when Emily arrived. Not sitting behind his desk, but standing at the window, looking out at the garden with his hands clasped behind his back and his jacket off, which she had come to recognize in 3 years of proximity as a sign that the performance layer had dropped. Jacket on was for meetings, for presentations of authority. Jacket off was for the moments when Victor Calloway was actually thinking. He didn't turn around when she entered. He said, "How long have you worked here?" 3 years in April. Before 6:30 this morning, had you ever been in that garage? Twice. Once when I was asked to retrieve something from one of the storage units down there, and once when I got lost my first week and ended up going through the wrong door. Did Marcus know you were there this morning? No, I don't think so. I didn't make any noise. I went back upstairs through the same door. Why didn't you come to me immediately? The question was asked without inflection. No accusation, no real curiosity, just a flat query that expected an accurate answer. She gave him one. Because I spent 2 hours trying to decide if I was going to say anything at all. He turned around. He looked at her for a long moment. His face was doing the careful neutral thing again, but there was something underneath it now that she couldn't quite read, something that was working through several things at once. He said, "And what decided it?" She said, "I kept thinking about how you'd probably die on the way to whatever meeting you had, and I didn't want to have done nothing. That's not self-interest." "No. Most people in your position would have decided self-interest was the appropriate framework." "I know," Emily said. "I almost did." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're going to move to a safe house. Today. Dominic will arrange it. You won't be going back to your apartment or making contact with anyone you know until this is handled." Emily said, "What does handled mean?" Victor said, "It means I find Marcus and find out who he was working for. It means anyone connected to this morning is gone by the end of the week." She absorbed that. She said, "And me?" "You'll be protected." "For how long?" "Until it's handled." She looked at him. He looked at her. The gap between their respective understandings of the word handled was probably significant, and they both knew it, and neither of them addressed it. She said, "Okay." He said, "Don't leave the safe house. Don't go anywhere without a security detail. Don't make calls on your personal phone. Dominic will give you a clean one." She said, "Mr. Calloway." "What?" "I wasn't fishing for anything. When I stopped you, I didn't want to have done nothing." Victor Calloway looked at the woman who had just saved his life, and he looked at her with an expression that she couldn't fully catalog. And he said, "I know." The safe house was in Logan Square, a 3-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a building that Dominic described, with characteristic understatement, as managed by people we trust. 2 agents downstairs, 2 on the floor, and 1 who would be staying in the unit itself. A woman named Carmen, who had the build of someone who did unpleasant things professionally and the manner of someone who had stopped pretending otherwise. Emily arrived at the safe house at noon. By 3 o'clock, she had reorganized the kitchen, identified 2 structural security problems with the apartment's layout that she relayed to Carmen with an apologetic precision that Carmen found surprising enough to actually note, and spent approximately 45 minutes sitting on the edge of the bed in the room they had given her, looking at the clean phone Dominic had provided, thinking about her mother. She did not call her mother. She understood why she couldn't. She understood also that the situation was larger than she had been told, that whatever Marcus Reed had set in motion, whatever Victor was now working to untangle, it involved more than one man with a grievance and the means to act on it. She had worked in this house long enough to understand the difference between a personal betrayal and a structural problem, and what she had heard in that garage had the cold, premeditated quality of something structural. She had understood that even in the moment. She had understood it the way you understand a storm is coming before you can see clouds, through air pressure and bird behavior, and some older knowing that lives below the level of conscious thought. She sat on the edge of the bed in the Logan Square safe house, and she thought about what it meant to have made the choice she'd made, and whether it had been the right one, and whether there was any version of it that did not lead her to somewhere very dangerous very fast. She didn't arrive at an answer. She got up and went back to the kitchen and offered to make Carmen something to eat, because that was the other thing she did with stress. She fed people. Carmen, who had not eaten since 5 that morning, accepted without hesitation. At 6 in the evening, Victor was in his secondary operations center, a reinforced room in the basement of his Wicker Park property, where the walls held screens and the air smelled like recycled ventilation, and the absence of windows was a feature rather than an oversight, when the first real picture of the conspiracy began to emerge. Tyler Brooks had been located. He had not gotten far. 2 of Dominic's men had picked him up at a bus station on the north side with a bag containing approximately $40,000 in cash and a one-way ticket to Milwaukee. Brooks was 24 years old and sufficiently frightened by the time he arrived in the operations center that his usefulness as an information source was limited only by the speed at which he could articulate what he knew, which was more than Victor had expected. "Marcus Reed," Brooks explained, in a voice that kept cracking at the edges, the voice of a young man who had understood too late what category of situation he had inserted himself into, was not the architect of what was happening. Marcus was a component, a capable, central component, but operating under direction from someone higher, someone who had been building toward this moment for, by Brooks's account, at least 18 months. Brooks didn't know the name. He had only ever dealt with Marcus directly, but he knew the scope, which was wider than Victor had assumed, and he knew the timeline, which was shorter. The plan hadn't stopped when the bomb was found. It had pivoted. Whatever came next was already in motion. Victor looked at the screens. He looked at the city map and its layered indicators, property locations, personnel positions, vehicle routes, and he thought about the size of what he was dealing with. Dominic, standing at his shoulder, said, "You want to bring in more people?" Victor said, "Not yet. I don't know who else is inside." "That's the problem." "That's the whole problem," Victor said. "Someone with access, with time, with the patience to build something like this for 18 months, that's not Marcus working alone. That's someone who understood the architecture of this organization well enough to move inside it without being seen." Dominic said, "Someone with authority." "Someone with authority," Victor agreed, "and a reason." His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. The number was blocked. He answered. A voice he almost recognized said, "She's still alive. Thought you'd want to know." Victor said, "Who is this?" "Don't waste time on that. Waste time on something useful." A pause. "There's a list, Victor, inside the organization. Names of people who've been talking to outsiders. You know what kind of outsiders. Your man Marcus found out about the list and decided to act before it became a problem for him. You following me? Keep going. The people whose names are on that list, they're scared, and scared people do stupid things. The next move isn't the one you're expecting." The line went dead. Victor stood holding the phone. Dominic watched him. Victor said, "Find Emily, right now. Call Carmen." Dominic was already dialing. He let it ring. It rang 12 times. Carmen didn't answer. The call came from a hospital dispatcher at 7:14 in the evening. A woman matching Emily Parker's description, no identification on her, no personal phone, a clean number that no one at St. Matthew's could trace, had been brought in by paramedics approximately 20 minutes earlier. She had been found in an alley 4 blocks from the Logan Square safe house. Multiple blunt force injuries, compromised breathing, unconscious. Status, critical. Victor got the call from the St. Matthew's admissions desk because she had, at some point before losing consciousness, managed to say 2 words that the paramedic noted in his report and that the admissions clerk had followed up on against all probability. The 2 words were Calloway. Victor. Victor was in the car before Dominic finished reading the report aloud. He didn't put his jacket back on. He moved through the hospital lobby the way a weather system moves, not rushing exactly, not slow, but with a mass and a direction that made the space around him reorganize itself by instinct. Nurses stepped aside. A doctor started to ask something and then looked at Victor's face and decided not to. He found her room on the 4th floor. He stood in the doorway. Emily Parker lay connected to monitors and IV lines, her face a geography of bruises, her breathing mechanical and even and terrifyingly fragile sounding. The left side of her face was swollen nearly shut. There was a long laceration across her collarbone that had been cleaned and closed. Her right hand, lying open on the blanket, held a torn scrap of fabric, blue-black silk, the kind of material that was not bought cheaply, pressed between her fingers with the grip of someone who had grabbed it in a moment of desperate fading intention. Victor looked at that fabric. He recognized it, not the specific piece, the pattern, the weave, the hand of the cloth. It was from a tie. One of 3 ties, custom made from a particular supplier, presented as a gift to senior members of his organization at a dinner last year. Symbolic. Exclusive. A small gesture of belonging. He reached into his jacket, the jacket Dominic had pressed into his hands on the way out of the building, the jacket he had shrugged on without thinking, and his fingers found the same material, same weave, same weight. He counted the men who had received those ties. He counted 6 names. One of them was the person who had ordered Emily Parker beaten in an alley. One of them was the person who had been building against him for 18 months. One of them was in this organization right now, tonight, thinking themselves untouchable. Victor Calloway stood in the doorway of Emily Parker's hospital room, and he looked at the torn scrap of fabric in her hand, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time shift inside his chest. Something old and cold and entirely patient, The part of him that had survived 17 years in a business that ate people alive, the part that never panicked and never rushed and never made its move until the moment was exactly right. He looked at Dominic. He said, "Well, close the floor." Then he walked to the chair beside Emily's bed, sat down, and waited. Outside, the Chicago rain came down hard against the hospital windows, and somewhere in the city, the man who had put her here was already making his next mistake. The floor went quiet in 11 minutes. That was how long it took Dominic to coordinate with hospital administration, position 4 agents at the stairwell exits, 2 at the elevator bank, and 1 outside the door of Emily Parker's room with instructions that were simple enough to follow without clarification. Nobody enters without Dominic's direct authorization, and if anyone pushes back on that, they are to be held where they stand until someone with more authority arrives to sort it out. The head nurse on the 4th floor, a broad-shouldered woman in her 50s named Pauline, who had worked ICU for 22 years and had encountered most categories of difficult situation the job could produce, came to find Victor 12 minutes after the floor was secured. She stood in the doorway of Emily's room with her arms folded and her expression set in the particular configuration that indicated she was prepared to be reasonable, but not indefinitely. She said, "I need to understand what's happening on my floor." Victor looked up from the chair. He said, "A patient is being protected." "From what?" "From whatever put her here." Pauline looked at Emily. She looked at Victor. She looked at the agent visible through the window of the room door, standing with his back to the corridor and his hands at his sides. She said, "Is she in immediate danger?" Victor said, "I don't know yet. That's why the floor is closed. I have other patients. Your other patients are fine. No one comes in or out without clearance. That's the arrangement." "I wasn't aware we had an arrangement." "We do now," Victor said. Not unkindly, just with the finality of someone who was not going to be moved. Pauline held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "If her condition changes, my team needs unrestricted access to this room." "Agreed. If I determine that any of your people are interfering with patient care, they won't be." She held the look another beat. Then she uncrossed her arms, nodded once, and left. Victor watched her go. He had dealt with harder negotiations. He had also dealt with people who had more actual power in their particular domain than they recognized. And Pauline struck him as one of those people, which meant the agreement he'd made needed to be honored precisely. He turned back to Emily's bed. Her breathing had steadied since he arrived. Still mechanical sounding, still wrong in the particular way that a body fighting for equilibrium sounds wrong. But the monitors were holding their lines, and the attending physician had said, with the careful optimism of someone who had learned not to promise things in ICU, that the next 4 hours would tell them more than the last 2. Victor sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at her hand, the one still loosely holding the torn fabric, and thought about 6 names. Dominic came in at 8:40 with a tablet and a face that had moved past its usual economy of expression into something flatter and more deliberate, which Victor had learned over 11 years meant the information was bad in a specific way. Not chaotic bad, but structured bad, the kind of bad that had been built with intention. He said, "Nathan Hayes." Victor said, "Talk." Dominic sat in the second chair, the one the nurses used when they needed to chart at the bedside, and turned the tablet so Victor could see the screen. "I pulled the security logs from the last 6 months, full access records, vehicle movements, communication metadata where we have it. I was looking for patterns consistent with someone building a coalition inside the organization without triggering the standard flags." He paused. "Nathan's name comes up 47 times in contexts where it shouldn't." "Bo-suki sho maowan," Victor said. 47. Meetings that weren't logged. A vehicle registered to one of his personal holdings appearing near 3 locations we later identified as connected to Marcus Reed. Twice at the port, once near the Bridgeport situation that your 2 lieutenants couldn't resolve, which now looks less like incompetence and more like someone with authority over both of them, making sure resolution wasn't possible. Victor looked at the screen. He looked at the movement logs. He looked at the dates. Nathan Hayes had been appointed security chief 6 weeks ago, after Marcus Reed's promotion had created a vacancy in the organizational structure. He was 51, had run logistics and external relations for the organization for 7 years, and had been, in Victor's assessment, in Dominic's assessment, in the assessment of everyone who evaluated these things, exactly the right person for the role. Measured, strategic, completely loyal, 18 months. He was building this before Marcus moved, Victor said. Marcus was his instrument, Dominic said. The bomb? That was Nathan's play, not Marcus's idea. Marcus had the access and the willingness. Nathan provided the direction and the resources. And the tie. Dominic looked at Emily's hand. He said, the ties were Nathan's suggestion. He proposed them at the dinner as a morale gesture. I thought it was unusual for him. He's not typically a gesture-oriented person. But the idea was well received, so I didn't push on it. So he knew who had one. He selected the supplier. He coordinated the presentation. Yes. A pause. He gave himself a reason to know exactly which 6 people had that fabric in their possession. Victor sat back. He sent the killer to the safe house. The timeline fits. Carmen was found in the building's service stairwell. Subdued. She's alive. She's being treated. But whoever took her out did it fast and clean. Professional. The 2 agents downstairs were handled at the same time within a 90-second window. That's coordinated. That's not improvised. Emily left the safe house. The door to the stairwell was locked from outside. She couldn't have gotten out that way. Dominic's voice stayed level, but something tightened at the edges of it. We think she heard something. The agent's going down, maybe Carmen, and she made a decision. Victor said, she ran. She tried to. She got 4 blocks. The room was quiet except for the monitors. Victor said, who knew about the safe house? 6 people confirmed. Myself, Garrett, Carmen, 2 agents who transported her, and Nathan, who as security chief receives all safe house assignments automatically as part of the operational protocol I established before I understood. Dominic stopped. He put the tablet down on his knee. Before I understood that the protocol was a problem. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the silence of 2 men who had worked together for 11 years, absorbing the specific weight of a mistake that had cost someone something they couldn't take back. Victor said, you didn't know. I should have flagged it. You didn't know, Victor said again. It wasn't absolution. It was a statement of operational fact delivered without inflection, and Dominic received it as such, which was the only way either of them knew how to move forward in a moment like this. At 9:15, Victor's phone rang. Not the clean phone, his personal one. The number known to fewer than 20 people, all of them within the organization or connected to it in ways that had been extensively vetted. The number on the screen belonged to Nathan Hayes. Victor looked at it for 3 rings. Then he answered. Nathan said, I heard about the hospital. I'm sorry, Victor. Genuinely. His voice was the same as it always was. Moderate, unhurried, carrying the slight gravelly quality of a man who had smoked for 20 years and quit a decade ago, and whose voice still carried the memory of it. Victor had sat across from that voice in 50 meetings. He had trusted that voice with information that could have dismantled his organization. Victor said, Where are you? At the tower. I came in when I heard about the incident. Figured you'd want senior people operational through the night. Thoughtful. It's a bad situation. I want to help. Victor looked at Dominic, who was already on a secondary phone, already pulling the tower's internal camera feeds. He would know within 3 minutes whether Nathan was actually there. Victor said, What do you know about what happened to Emily Parker? A pause. Measured, but not too long. The pause of a man who is deciding what level of concern to perform. Only what Garrett briefed the senior team on an hour ago. She was the housekeeper who flagged the vehicle. She was being protected and someone got to her. Another pause. Do we know who? We're working on it. Is she going to make it? Doctors aren't sure yet. Shame, Nathan said. She was brave. What she did this morning, that took guts. Victor said, It did. You need me to coordinate anything from here? I can run the overnight command if you want to stay at the hospital. I'll be in touch, Victor said, and ended the call. Dominic looked up from his secondary phone. He said, He's there. Northwest conference room on the 14th floor. 2 men with him. I don't have IDs on them yet. The camera angle is partial. Unknown men in the tower at 9 in the evening. In a room that doesn't have a direct sightline to the main security desk. Victor stood up from the chair. He moved to the window and stood with his back to the room, looking out at the city. The towers lit against the dark, the expressway lights, the particular orange wash of a Chicago night sky that people who grew up here either loved or associated with everything they'd left behind. He said, "He called to take my temperature." "Yes." "He wants to know how much I know." "He knows about the safe house. He knows about Emily. He doesn't know about Brooks yet." Dominic checked something on his phone. "Brooks is still contained. He's been moved to the secondary location." "Good." Victor turned around. "Nathan thinks he's still ahead of this. He called because a man who's guilty but thinks he's clean calls to check in. It's what an innocent man would do, and he's careful enough to perform it." He looked at Emily again, at the steady, terrible patience of her unconscious breathing, at the fragment of blue-black silk still pressed between her fingers. "He doesn't know about the fabric. If he did, he wouldn't have sent someone who was wearing the tie. Or he sent someone wearing it deliberately, to tell me something." Dominic was quiet for a moment, then, "That's a different kind of play." "That's a man who thinks he's already won," Victor said, "and wants me to know it." Garrett arrived at 10 with two things: a coffee that Victor didn't ask for but accepted, and a name. The name was Daniel Cho. 43, former military. Currently operating under a consulting cover that 3 different layers of investigation had failed to penetrate until Garrett's team applied pressure to a financial thread that ran from one of Nathan's personal accounts, through 2 shell structures, to a management fee paid quarterly to a company that existed only on paper and listed Daniel Cho as its sole employee. Cho was the professional, the one who had been in the Logan Square building, the one who had put Emily in this hospital and left 4 blocks away when he was satisfied she was finished. Garrett put the file on the empty chair and said, "We have a last known location. As of 6 hours ago, he was in a hotel in the South Loop. We've had eyes on the building for the last 40 minutes. Victor said, "Is he still there?" "Room hasn't moved. Keycard log shows no exits since check-in." Victor said, "I want him." Garrett said, "The team is ready?" "Alive, Garrett." "Understood." "And quiet. Nothing that makes noise downtown." Garrett nodded. He picked up his phone and stepped into the corridor. Victor drank the coffee. It was bad. Vending machine bad. The kind of coffee that had been sitting in a heated container long enough to develop a sourness at the back of the throat. And he drank it anyway because he had been awake since 5 in the morning and the night was not close to finished. He looked at Emily. She hadn't moved. Her hand was still. The monitors ran their lines. He thought about what she had said in his study. "I kept thinking about how you'd probably die, and I didn't want to have done nothing." He had heard those words and categorized them correctly in the moment. Honest, unstrategic, the words of someone who had made a decision based on something that wasn't self-interest. He had categorized them correctly, and then, because correct categorization was a professional habit and not the same as understanding, he had moved on to the operational next steps. He was not moving on now. He sat in the chair beside her bed in the 4th floor ICU of St. Matthew Medical Center, and he held the bad coffee, and he let himself sit with the fact that this woman, who he had not bothered to actually see in 3 years of daily proximity, had done the most consequential thing anyone had done for him since his father died, and had done it not for money or positioning or leverage, but because she didn't want to have done nothing. He understood that. He also understood, looking at what it had cost her, that understanding it was insufficient. The call from Garrett came at 11:47. Daniel Cho was not in the hotel room. The room contained a bed that had not been slept in, a suitcase containing clothes and a false-bottomed compartment that had recently been emptied, and a window that looked out onto a fire escape that connected to the building's rear alley. The keycard log showed no exits because the fire escape door operated on a separate system that Cho had apparently identified and accounted for. He had been gone, by Garrett's estimate, for at least 4 hours. Victor received this information standing at the window of Emily's room and said nothing for approximately 15 seconds. Then he said, "He's not running." Garrett said, "No." He had time to run. He had resources. He left because he was directed to, not because he panicked. Nathan pulled him out. Nathan pulled him out and repositioned him. Victor looked at the city. He looked at the darkness and the lights. Which means Nathan knows we're looking, which means his phone buzzed. A different one. The operations center line. He switched. A tech named Rowan, whose voice he recognized from overnight shifts, said, "Mr. Calloway, we just intercepted something from the tower. Internal communication, flagged by the automated system as anomalous because of the encryption level. It's above what our standard internal traffic uses." "What does it say?" "We're still working on the decrypt, but the metadata tells us something." A pause. "It was sent from the 14th floor at 11:32. It went to 15 recipients." 15. Victor said, "How many people does Nathan Hayes have access to in senior organizational roles?" Rowan said, "Across all divisions?" 22. 15 out of 22. Victor closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. He opened them. He said, "Get me Dominic." Dominic arrived back at the hospital at midnight. He had been at the Wicker Park Operations Center, running the Brooks debrief and coordinating the search for Marcus Reed, who remained as of midnight unlocated, which was itself a piece of information because Marcus Reed had resources and connections and had clearly used both to move quickly, and the direction of his movement mattered. Dominic sat down. He looked at the 15 recipient count. He looked at Victor. He said, "He's not waiting for the right moment. He thinks this is it." He moved when he found out about the hospital. He figured I'd be distracted, watching Emily running reactive instead of forward. "Are you?" Victor said. "What do you think?" Dominic looked at him steadily. "I think you've been sitting in this room for 4 hours, and you've run more of this operation from that chair than Nathan Hayes has from the 14th floor of his own tower." A pause. "But I also think he has 15 people, and we currently don't know which 15. "Then we find out tonight," Victor said, "before he makes his next move. Because once he moves with 15 people, it's not a coup attempt anymore. See, it's a succession. And handling a succession is a different kind of problem. How do you want to approach it?" Victor stood up. He put on his jacket. He looked at Emily one more time. The monitors, the hand, the torn fabric. He said, "Call the tower. Tell them I'm coming in. Tell them I want a full senior leadership meeting at 2 a.m. Everyone, no exceptions, mandatory attendance." He moved toward the door. "If Nathan's going to make his play tonight, let's give him a room to make it in." Dominic said, "And if he comes in armed?" "Then we'll find out a lot of things very quickly," Victor said. He was 2 steps into the corridor when his phone buzzed again. Chug. Not a call this time. A message. Single image. No text. No sender identification. The image was a photograph. It had been taken from the corridor outside Emily Parker's hospital room. The timestamp in the corner read 11:51 p.m., 8 minutes ago. Victor looked at the photograph. He looked at the timestamp. He looked at the corridor he was currently standing in, at the agent posted outside Emily's door, at the nurse's station 20 feet away. The photograph had been taken 8 minutes ago from inside this corridor, which meant whoever had taken it had been standing here 8 minutes ago, which meant the floor wasn't clean. Victor turned back toward Emily's room. He moved fast, not running, but close, that particular controlled velocity of a man who has decided that speed matters more than appearance. He pushed through the door. Emily was still. The monitors were running. The room was the window. The window was open 3 inches. It had been closed when he left. He was certain of it. He was certain because he was a man who noticed things when they mattered, and in the last 4 hours, every detail of this room had mattered. 3 inches of Chicago night came through the gap. Cold air and rain and the distant mechanical sound of the city. And on the windowsill, barely visible against the white paint, a single strip of paper, folded twice. Victor picked it up. He unfolded it. 4 words, printed in clean block letters. "She has 10 minutes. Victor looked at the monitors. He looked at Emily's IV line, the clear tube running from the bag above the bed down to the catheter in her arm. And he looked at the point where the tube connected to the port, and he saw at the junction a tiny additional line that had not been there when he sat beside this bed. Thin, almost invisible, inserted with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. His voice, when he called for the nurse, came out completely flat. "Get the doctor, now. The IV line has been compromised." The corridor outside erupted. Pauline appeared in the doorway within seconds, took one look at what Victor was pointing at, and started shouting instructions that cleared the room of everything except medical personnel and the particular focused chaos of people trying to stop something that had already started. The next 4 minutes were the longest of Victor Calloway's life. He stood against the far wall of Emily's room, pressed there by Pauline's arm, physically moved aside with a force that brooked zero argument, and he watched 3 medical staff work on the IV line with the focused, airless efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this and were now performing it under conditions they hadn't trained for, which was a man in a suit standing 6 feet away, radiating the particular energy of someone who was holding himself very still because the alternative was catastrophic. The attending physician, young, Korean-American, a resident named Park, who Victor had seen twice in the corridor and who now appeared to have aged 5 years in the last 90 seconds, disconnected the compromised line, capped the port, and began checking Emily's vitals with a speed that communicated urgency without announcing panic. Victor watched Emily's face. It didn't change. She was still unconscious. The monitors ran their lines, Park said without looking up. Whatever was in the secondary line, she didn't receive a full dose. The drip rate was slow, either intentional or the line was only recently inserted and hadn't delivered much volume yet. Victor said, "Is she going to be all right?" Not a question. A demand for information delivered in the register of a question. Park said, "We're running a panel right now. I need 20 minutes. "You have 10. Park looked at him. Park was young enough that the look still carried some genuine surprise in it. The residual surprise of someone who had not yet fully learned that certain men in certain rooms do not respond to the normal logic of who is actually in charge. Pauline put her hand on Victor's arm. She said very quietly, "Let him work." Victor looked at her hand on his arm. He looked at her face. He said nothing, and he stayed where he was, and he let Park work. In the corridor, Dominic was systematic in the way that made him valuable. He had the agent who had been posted outside Emily's door, a man named Reyes, 26, 18 months with the organization, standing against the wall with his hands visible and his face doing the thing faces do when a person is genuinely frightened and trying not to show it. Dominic stood in front of him with his tablet and his flat water expression and walked through the last 40 minutes in 90-second intervals. Reyes had not left his post. He was certain of that. He had seen no one enter the room. He had not been approached. He had checked his phone twice. Messages from his wife, he said. She was due in 3 weeks, and had otherwise maintained visual on the door. Dominic said, "The window." Reyes said, "What about it?" "It's on the exterior wall. What's below it?" A pause. Reyes processed. There's a maintenance ledge. I saw it when we secured the floor, but it's narrow. Maybe 14 inches. Is it accessible from the exterior? From the floor below, maybe. There's a service ladder on the south face of the building. I flagged it when we did the sweep, but the assessment was that it was too exposed. Anyone on that ladder would be visible from the parking structure across the street, Dominic said, at 1 a.m. Reyes stopped talking. Dominic said, "Not from the corridor, not from inside this floor, from outside." He made a note on the tablet. Cho. He came back? He never left the area, Dominic said. He repositioned. Nathan pulled him out of the hotel and repositioned him. He looked at the window at the end of the corridor, the one facing the parking structure, the one that was currently showing him a slice of Chicago night and the lit upper levels of a concrete deck 200 feet away. He was waiting for Victor to leave the room, Reyes said, but Mr. Calloway didn't leave the room. He left for 40 seconds, to take the call in the corridor. Dominic looked at him. 40 seconds was enough. Victor came out of Emily's room at 1:23 with the 20-minute panel results in his hand, a printed sheet that Park had given him with the particular careful neutrality of someone delivering news that is bad but not catastrophic, which is its own specific emotional register, and found Dominic waiting. The panel showed traces of a sedative compound in Emily's bloodstream, enough to have been dangerous given her current condition, not enough to have been immediately fatal. Park's working theory was that the dosage had been calibrated to kill slowly rather than quickly, which was a choice that communicated something about the person who had made it. Fast was loud. Slow was invisible. Slow looked like complications. Victor folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket. He said, "Cho." "Almost certainly," Dominic said. "Exterior approach. Maintenance ledge. Window." He was in and out in under 2 minutes. "He's still in the area." I have people on the parking structure and the surrounding blocks. If he's still within 300 meters, we'll find him." Dominic paused. "But Victor, he took a significant risk coming back here. That's not operational caution. That's a deadline. Nathan's deadline. Emily alive is a liability. She heard Marcus in the garage. She can connect the conspiracy to the operation. If she wakes up and talks, she becomes the chain of evidence," Victor said. "Nathan needs her gone before she can speak to anyone with the authority to act on it." Victor looked at the door of Emily's room. He said, "Move her." "To where?" "We don't have a secure facility that Nathan doesn't. Find one he doesn't know about." Victor turned. "Not a safe house? Not a property? A facility that hasn't been in any operational brief Nathan has received. Something off the books." Dominic was quiet for a moment, then, "My brother-in-law runs a private medical clinic in Evanston. Small, fully equipped for post-trauma care. It's not connected to anything. Can he be trusted? He doesn't know what I do for a living. He thinks I work in corporate security. Keep it that way. Make the call." Victor started moving toward the elevator. "And get me everything on Nathan's current position. Every camera, every contact, every vehicle registered to him or to anyone in his household." "You're going to the tower." "I'm going to the tower," Victor said. "Victor." Dominic's voice stopped him. There was something in it. Not hesitation. Dominic didn't hesitate, but a weight. Nathan has 15 people, senior people, people who have been with this organization for years. When you walk into that building, I know. I'm not sure you can walk out of it the same way you walked in. Victor looked at him. He said, "I know that too." He pressed the elevator button and waited, and the elevator came, and he got in. The Callaway Tower stood 42 stories above downtown Chicago, a glass and steel structure that Victor's father had acquired the naming rights to in 1994 as a statement about permanence. The organization's legitimate holdings occupied 7 floors. The upper executive suites occupied 3 more. The 14th floor, the one Nathan Hayes had chosen for his 1152 communication to 15 recipients, was officially designated as a conference and strategy center, which meant it had soundproofing, multiple exit routes, and a communications infrastructure that had been built to operate independently of the building's main systems. Nathan had chosen it with knowledge. Victor rode up in the executive elevator alone because Dominic was managing the Emily transfer and Garrett was coordinating the exterior search for Cho, and because Victor had made a calculation that arriving with a visible security force was the wrong signal. He needed Nathan to believe for as long as possible that this was a meeting, not a confrontation, a meeting. The lobby had been quiet, skeleton overnight staff, 2 security guards who had waved him through with the automatic deference of people who had been doing it for years and had never had a reason to think about it. The elevator ride took 41 seconds. Victor counted them. The 14th floor corridor was lit at full brightness despite the hour. That was wrong. Overnight protocol dimmed the corridor lighting to 40%. Full brightness meant people had been in the corridor recently, within the last 30 minutes, and had not reset the override. Victor stood in the corridor and looked at the length of it. 12 doors. The conference room at the far end. Through the frosted glass panel beside the door, light. He walked. He did not knock. He put his hand on the door handle and he opened it. Nathan Hayes was standing at the head of the conference table. He was 51 years old, medium height, with the lean build of a man who had always taken care of himself without making a performance of it. His hair was silver gray and his face was the kind of face that had probably been unremarkable at 30 and had become, with age, the kind of face you remembered. Defined, controlled, capable of warmth and equally capable of its absence. He was wearing the tie. The blue-black silk tie from last year's dinner, and he was wearing it at 2 a.m. in an empty conference room. And Victor noticed that the moment he walked in and filed it and did not react to it, 4 men stood at various positions around the room. Victor recognized 2 of them, senior personnel, one from logistics, one from the Eastern District operations. The other 2 were unknown, large positioned near the room's secondary exit, not dressed like organizational staff. Cho's colleagues, possibly. Nathan looked at Victor with an expression that moved through something quickly, surprise, recalibration, performance, and settled on a version of professional concern. He said, Victor, I didn't expect you until morning. Victor said, "Where's Marcus?" Not a greeting, not a preamble, just the question, dropped into the room like something heavy. Nathan said, "I don't know. The team is looking." "He's yours," Victor said. "He was always yours. The bomb, the safe house, the man on the exterior ledge at St. Matthew's tonight. All of it traces back through Marcus and through Cho and through the money you've been moving for the last 18 months. He walked to the table. He did not sit. "I want to know where Marcus is, because Marcus can fill in the pieces you're going to tell me you don't know about." The room was very still. Nathan said, "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation," Victor said. "It's a summary. The accusation phase is finished." Something shifted in Nathan's face. The performance layer, the professional concern, the practice neutrality, didn't crack exactly, but it moved. Like a mask that has been worn long enough to leave an impression, and when it's removed, the impression remains, but the mask is gone. He said, "How much do you actually have?" "Enough to end this conversation in two different ways. One of them is better for you than the other. You came here alone. I came here to give you a choice." Nathan was quiet for 4 seconds. Victor counted those too. Then Nathan said, "You built something extraordinary, Victor, genuinely. Your father built a foundation and you built something extraordinary on top of it, but you're not what this organization needs anymore. You're reactive, you're sentimental." His eyes moved to Victor's jacket pocket, where the folded paper from the hospital panel was. "A housekeeper. You shut down an entire hospital floor for a housekeeper. She saved my life. She's a liability. She's a thread. Every person who knows what happened in that garage is a thread that someone can pull." He spread his hands, a reasonable gesture, a "here is my logic" gesture. "I've been in this organization for 9 years. I know how it runs. I know what it needs. What I did, everything I've done over the last 18 months, was to build something that would survive past you, past your attachments, past your—" "Stop." Victor's voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It had the quality of a door closing, definitive, mechanical, the sound of a thing that was finished. He said, "Tell me where Marcus is." Nathan looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the 2 men near the secondary exit and gave them a nod that was very small and very clear. The man from logistics moved first, or started to. Victor had already moved because he had been watching the logistics man's weight shift for the previous 20 seconds and had calculated the likely direction, and he moved to intercept before the initiation was complete. And what followed was not a fight in any cinematic sense, but a brutal, grinding, furniture-crashing minute and 40 seconds of 2 men trying to damage each other in a confined space. And Victor took hits that he would feel for a week, and he delivered ones that ended the logistics man's participation immediately and the Eastern District man's 30 seconds later. The 2 unknown men did not move. Nathan did not move. Victor stood in the wreckage of a conference room chair, breathing hard, with a cut above his left eyebrow that was running blood in a thin line down toward his cheekbone. He looked at Nathan. He looked at the 2 unknown men. He said to the unknown men, "Leave." They looked at Nathan. Nathan said nothing. They left. The room was quiet except for Victor's breathing and the distant sound of Chicago through the tower glass. Nathan sat down. He sat down in the chair at the head of the table with the deliberate, considered movement of a man who was recalibrating in real time, assessing what had just happened, assessing what it meant, assessing what options remained. Victor pulled out a chair across from him and sat. He pressed the back of his wrist against the cut above his eyebrow. His wrist came away red. He looked at it and set it on the table. He said, "The 15 people you messaged at 11:52. Nathan said, "What about them? How many of them are actually committed to what you were planning, and how many of them received your message and immediately started looking for a way to distance themselves?" A pause. "Because I know these people," Victor said. "I've known most of them for years, and I know that an encrypted message at midnight from a security chief who is actively being investigated, which they will know by now, some of them will know, does not read as a strength play. It reads as a man who is running out of time and calling in markers he isn't sure he has." Nathan's jaw moved. Something worked behind his eyes. Victor said, "Give me Marcus, give me Cho, Give me the full accounting. Every person you brought into this, every resource you moved, every commitment you made on behalf of this organization without authorization. He leaned forward slightly. And I will give you the only version of this that doesn't end in a way that neither of us wants to spend time describing. Nathan looked at him for a long time. The clock on the conference room wall read 2:17 a.m. Nathan said, Marcus is in Gary, warehouse on the industrial corridor, east of the rail yard. One of mine, not on any organizational record. He said it the way a man says something when he has decided that the mathematics have shifted and recalculation is more useful than resistance. Flat. Factual. Victor said, Cho. I don't have a current location. He was supposed to check in at midnight. He didn't. Why didn't he check in? Because your people were covering the area around the hospital, and he's professional enough not to check in when he's compromised. A pause. He'll surface when he thinks it's clear. He won't get the chance, Victor said. Victor. Nathan's voice changed. Just slightly. Just enough. The operational flatness dropped a fraction, and something else came through. Something that might have been, in another man at another time, called candor. The 15 people. Not all of them were willing participants. Some of them were coerced. Information I had about them, situations I documented over the years. I used it. He let that sit. You should know that before you decide how to handle each of them. Victor looked at him. Why are you telling me that? Because some of those people are valuable to you. Because losing them unnecessarily would cost you more than it would cost me. A pause. And because I've been in this organization for 9 years, and I am not entirely without his phone, on the table beside his right hand, lit up. Victor saw the screen from across the table. The name on it was one he recognized. A name he had not expected to see on Nathan's phone at 2 a.m, connected to this, connected to any of this. He looked at the name. He looked at Nathan. Nathan looked back at him with an expression that had moved past recalibration into something that was almost apologetic, which was the expression of a man who knows that the next 10 seconds are going to change everything the other person thought he understood about the last several years. Victor reached across the table and turned the phone face up. He read the name. He sat with it for 3 seconds. Then he said, very quietly, the words coming out with the particular flatness of a man whose interior architecture has just sustained structural damage and is currently running the assessment. How long? Nathan said, 4 years. 4 years, Victor repeated. It started before Marcus, before any of this. It started as information, nothing operational, just 4 years. Victor, the name on your phone, Victor said, is someone I trusted with information that I have never trusted to another living person. He stood up from the chair. He stood up slowly, the way a man stands when he is making sure his legs will hold, when he is not entirely certain that the floor beneath him is still where the floor is supposed to be. If what I'm reading means what I think it means, if this goes where I think it goes, he stopped. He looked at the city through the tower glass, 42 stories of it, dark and lit and indifferent. He said, everything I thought I knew about the last 4 years. Nathan said nothing. Everything I thought I understood about why certain things happened the way they happened. Certain decisions. Certain losses. Victor's voice had gone very quiet. Not the controlled quiet of professional management. The other kind. The kind that comes from somewhere deeper and older and considerably more dangerous. The Harmon situation, 2 years ago. 3 people I trusted, gone in a week. I thought it was external. I spent 6 months looking outside. Victor. It wasn't external, Victor said. Nathan said nothing. The clock read 2:21. Victor picked up Nathan's phone from the table. He looked at the name on the screen one more time. He put the phone in his jacket pocket next to the folded hospital panel, and he walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. He said, without turning around, "You said I was sentimental." Nathan said, "Yes." "You're right," Victor said. "I was." He walked out of the conference room and into the corridor, and he stood against the wall for exactly 11 seconds with his eyes closed and his hand flat against the plaster, feeling the building hum against his palm, feeling the city 42 stories below, feeling the weight of 4 years of misdirected certainty settle on him like something physical, pressing down on his shoulders, settling into the joints of his hands, finding every place he'd taken a hit in that conference room and reminding him it was there. 11 seconds. Then he pushed off the wall and walked to the elevator and called Dominic. Who doesn't? Dominic answered on the first ring. Victor said, "Gary, industrial corridor east of the rail yard. Marcus is in a warehouse, one of Nathan's, off the books. I need a team there in 20 minutes. I can do 15. Don't move on it yet. I need to talk to you first." He stepped into the elevator. "And Dominic, I need you to pull everything we have on Richard Calloway." A pause, long enough to be significant. Dominic said, "Victor, pull it." "That's your—" "I know who it is," Victor said. "Pull it anyway." The elevator descended. Victor watched the floor numbers drop and held the phone against his ear and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else to say until he had Dominic in front of him and the information in his hands, and the particular kind of control that comes not from having answers, but from knowing exactly which questions to ask. Richard Calloway was his younger brother. The operations center in Wicker Park smelled like cold coffee and recycled air and the specific tension of a room where people had been working hard through the night without enough sleep. Victor arrived at 2:58 and found Dominic already at the main console with 3 analysts who had been pulled from whatever they'd been doing and redeployed without explanation, which was a thing Dominic could do and which they had learned over time not to question. Dominic turned from the screen when Victor came in. He looked at the cut above Victor's eyebrow, dried now, a dark line against the skin, and at Victor's jacket, which had taken the evening poorly. He did not comment on either. He said, "Richard," Victor said, "what do you have?" "Not enough." "Not yet." Dominic turned back to the screen. "But what I have is, it's not nothing." He pulled up a communication log. 3 contacts between a number registered to a holding company that traces back to your brother and a number we've connected to Nathan's external network. Over 4 years. Irregular intervals, 6 months, 8 months, but consistent. He paused. "The last contact was 10 days ago." 10 days ago, 4 days before Nathan was formally appointed security chief. Victor stood at the console and looked at the log and felt something cold move through him. Not surprise exactly, because surprise requires a level of unpreparedness that the last 3 hours had already stripped away. This was something different, something that had no clean name. The feeling of a man who has been operating on a map that was wrong from the beginning, and who is now holding the correct map and understanding, distance by distance, how far off course he has traveled. Richard was 34, 7 years younger. He had left Chicago at 22, officially to pursue finance in New York, and had spent the intervening 12 years building a career that was legitimate enough on its surface and that Victor had maintained at arm's length, deliberately, carefully, specifically to protect Richard from the parts of the Calloway world that Richard had always claimed he wanted no part of. Victor had believed him. He had believed his brother the way you believe the people you grew up alongside, which is to say, not entirely on evidence, but on accumulated history, on shared rooms and shared losses, and the particular knowledge of a person that comes from watching them grow up, which is a different and in some ways less reliable knowledge than the kind you assemble from behavior and data. He looked at the log. 4 years. He said, "Does Richard know what Nathan did tonight?" "The hospital." "Emily." Dominic said, "Unknown. The contact 10 days ago. We don't have content, only metadata. We don't know what was communicated. Can we get content?" "Working on it. Another hour, maybe 2. Victor looked at the clock on the wall. It read 3:04. He didn't have 2 hours. Nathan was contained but not secured. Victor had walked out of that conference room and left him there, which was a deliberate choice and also a ticking problem, because a man like Nathan with an active network does not sit in an empty conference room indefinitely. He makes calls, he repositions, he activates whatever contingencies he built for exactly this scenario, because a man who plans 18 months ahead builds contingencies. Marcus was in Gary. Cho was unlocated. Richard was where? New York, supposedly. 1,200 miles from Chicago and the wreckage of a plan that bore his fingerprints in ways Victor was only beginning to understand. He said, "Get me a location on Richard. Current. Not his registered address. Actual current location." One of the analysts said, "His phone pinged a tower on the north side 40 minutes ago." Victor turned. The analyst, young woman, early 20s, a tech specialist named Joe, who Victor had met twice and whose name he had remembered because she was precise in a way he valued, pulled the data onto the secondary screen without being asked. Cell tower data. His personal phone. It's not conclusive, but the ping places him within a 2-mile radius of... She stopped. She looked at the radius indicator on the screen. Victor looked at it. The radius encompassed the Callaway Tower. Richard was in Chicago. Richard had been in Chicago within 2 miles of the tower at 2:20 in the morning, which was approximately the same time Victor was sitting across from Nathan Hayes in the 14th floor conference room, learning that someone inside his closest world had been feeding the conspiracy for 4 years. Victor said, "He's here." Dominic said, "He's here." They looked at each other. Victor said, "Get Garrett. Get whoever is still operational and not running the Emily transfer. We're going to Gary first. I want Marcus before Nathan can warn him. Then we deal with Richard." He moved toward the door. "And Dominic, the 15 people Nathan messaged. Start running them down, one by one. I want to know who's coerced and who's committed, because Nathan told me some of them were leveraged, and if that's true, then I am not going to treat them the same as the ones who chose this." Dominic said, "Nathan told you that voluntarily." "He did." "Why?" "I don't know yet," Victor said. "Add it to the list of things I'm going to figure out before morning." The drive to Gary took 31 minutes at 3 in the morning with no traffic, and Garrett running the vehicle at a speed that was technically reckless and practically necessary. Victor sat in the back with 2 other agents and a map of the industrial corridor that Joe had printed and marked up with the satellite imagery she'd pulled in the 7 minutes between the order and departure. The warehouse was a low gray building set back from the rail corridor access road, surrounded by the particular desolation of industrial infrastructure that has been partially decommissioned. Adjacent buildings empty, fencing broken in 3 places, the access road unpaved for the last quarter mile. No lights visible from the exterior. 2 vehicles in the lot, both dark-colored, parked close to the building's south face. Victor looked at the vehicles. He looked at the building. He looked at the broken fencing. He said, "How many people did Nathan say were with Marcus?" Garrett said, "He didn't." "No," Victor said, "he didn't." He thought about that for the remaining 4 minutes of the drive, and what he arrived at, sitting in the back of a moving vehicle in the dark, with the Gary industrial corridor coming up on both sides, was that Nathan had given him the location easily. Too easily, maybe. Or exactly as easily as a man gives information when he has decided that the mathematics have shifted, and giving one thing up is the price of holding everything else. Or he had given it up because Marcus, from Nathan's current position, was already a liability. The vehicle stopped on the access road 200 meters from the warehouse. Victor got out. The air smelled like rain and rust and something chemical. Industrial residue, the permanent ghost of whatever had been processed in these buildings before they went quiet. He looked at the building. He said, "Garrett, south entrance, you and Chen. I'll take the north with Reyes." Garrett said, "Victor, don't. You're bleeding again." Victor touched the cut above his eyebrow. His fingers came away wet. He looked at them and wiped them on his jacket, which had reached the point in the evening where additional damage was not a meaningful category. He said, "South entrance, alt." The north door was unlocked. That was the first wrong thing. Victor pushed it open with his forearm and held the position for 3 seconds, listening. The building interior was dark except for a line of light visible at the far end. A door, slightly ajar, with something lit beyond it. The main floor of the warehouse was filled with the shapes of old equipment, covered machinery, stacked pallets, the skeletal framework of a conveyor system that had been stripped of its working parts. He moved through it with Reyes behind him, threading between the shapes, keeping to the wall. The floor was concrete. His footsteps were quieter than they should have been, which he realized after a moment was because the concrete was covered in a fine layer of something, dust, grit, that absorbed sound. He moved. The lit door at the far end opened onto a small interior office, a site manager's room, the kind of space that every industrial building had, and that accumulated the residue of whatever human habitation it had hosted. A desk, a broken chair, a wall-mounted board with nothing on it except the ghost outlines of papers that had been removed. A work light on the floor threw everything in harsh upward angles. Marcus Reed was sitting in the broken chair. He was not restrained. He was sitting voluntarily, or at least without physical constraint, with his elbows on his knees and his face down. He was wearing the same clothes Victor had last seen him in, which meant he had not slept, which meant he had been moving since 6:28 that morning when his vehicle left the mansion and had finally stopped here in this room, which was either a refuge or a trap, and Victor had not yet determined which. Marcus looked up when Victor came through the door. His face was wrong. Not frightened, which was what Victor expected. Not defiant, which was also possible. Wrong in a different way. The face of a man who has arrived through a very bad night, at the end of something. The particular exhaustion of a person who has been running on the energy of a bad decision and has finally run out of that energy and has nothing left but the decision itself, sitting there, finished, real. He said, "I wondered if it would be you or Nathan." Victor said, "Where's Cho?" Marcus said, "Gone. He was here for an hour. He left at midnight. I don't know where." "What did Nathan tell you about tonight?" "That it was handled." A pause. "He said the situation at the hospital was handled." "The situation at the hospital," Victor said, "is a woman who has been beaten, poisoned, and is currently being moved to a private facility because the hospital floor I secured was compromised within 4 hours." He came fully into the room. He stood 6 feet from Marcus and looked at him. "Did you know about Emily Parker when Nathan sent Cho after her?" Marcus's jaw moved. "Did you know?" Victor said again. "I knew she was a target." He said it without inflection. Then something shifted and he said, "I didn't know it would go that far. I'm not saying that to make it better. It doesn't make it better. I'm saying it because it's true, and I'm done lying about what's true." Victor looked at him for a long time. He said, "You planted a bomb in my vehicle." "Yes." "You were prepared for me to die." "Yes." "Why?" Marcus looked at his hands. He said, "Because Nathan told me you were planning to restructure the organization in a way that would eliminate my position. He said he had documentation, internal memos, a reorganization plan. He showed me something that looked—" He stopped. "It looked real. I believed it." He looked up. "I believed it because I'd been hearing things for months. Whispers. People saying the organization was going to contract, that senior positions were going to be consolidated." He shook his head. "I don't know now if any of it was real or if Nathan manufactured it." Victor said, "He manufactured it." Marcus closed his eyes. He opened them. He said, "Victor, don't. I need to." I said, "Don't." Victor's voice was flat and final. "You don't get to explain yourself to me right now. You get to give me everything you know about Nathan's network, every name, every resource, every piece of information he used to build the last 18 months. And you get to give it to me completely and immediately, because the alternative is that this conversation ends in a way that doesn't benefit either of us." He pulled out his phone. He opened the recording application. He set it on the desk between them. "Start." Marcus started. It took 47 minutes. Victor stood for all of it. His legs registered the previous 19 hours somewhere around the 30-minute mark and began the process of communicating that information through his knees and lower back in terms he could not ignore but chose to defer. He stood because sitting would have been the wrong signal. He stood because standing was what the moment required. Marcus talked. He talked in the flat, methodical way of a man who has made a decision to be accurate. Not generous, not self-exonerating, but accurate. And who is applying what focus he has left to the task of being precisely that. He gave names, he gave dates, he gave locations, transaction details, the identities of 3 external contacts that Nathan had used to move money and resources without creating an organizational paper trail. He gave Victor Richard, not Nathan's framing of Richard, not the 4-year conspiracy partner, the inside man, the deliberate architect. A different picture, more complicated. A younger man who had been approached with what was presented as a legitimate business opportunity, and who had become, gradually and without fully understanding what he was becoming, a conduit, used for financial structuring, given information selectively, led to believe he was helping Nathan modernize the organization at Victor's implicit direction. "Did Nathan tell Richard what he was actually doing?" Victor said. Marcus said, "I don't know for certain. What I know is that Nathan kept Richard compartmentalized. He told me once that Richard was—" he used the word insulated, That if anything went wrong, Richard's involvement would look like financial consulting, not conspiracy. He used Richard. He used everyone, Marcus said. That's what Nathan does. He finds the thing a person is afraid of losing, and he builds on that. Victor looked at the recording on the desk. He looked at Marcus. He said, "You had everything. The position, the authority, the access." He said it without heat, just stating the geography of what had been lost. "And you threw it away because Nathan showed you a piece of paper." Marcus said, "I threw it away because I was afraid." He said it without self-pity, which was the only way Victor could have tolerated hearing it. "I was afraid, and I didn't come to you." "No," Victor said. "You didn't." He picked up the phone. He stopped the recording. He said to Reyes, who had been standing outside the door for the last 47 minutes, "Secure him." He walked out of the warehouse into the Gary night. Cold air, chemical smell, the rail corridor dark in both directions. And he called Dominic. Dominic said, "Emily's transferred. She's stable. The clinic in Evanston has her. Clean, unconnected. My brother-in-law is handling it personally." Victor exhaled. He hadn't fully known he'd been holding that until it left. He said, "Richard? He's in a hotel in River North, the Kinsley, room 1407. He checked in last night under his own name, which means either he doesn't know he's exposed or he thinks he has nothing to hide. He has something to hide, he just doesn't know how much." Victor started walking toward the vehicle. "Have someone in the lobby when I arrive. Don't approach him, don't spook him." He reached the vehicle and got in. "And Dominic, I need the full 15-name list, the people Nathan messaged. I need it before I go to the hotel." "I have it." "How many committed? How many coerced?" "Best current assessment, 4 committed, 11 coerced. The 11 have been making contact with each other since midnight. Encrypted communications, but the pattern is one of people trying to find an exit." "They're scared. They're terrified," Dominic said. "And they should be, but some of them, Victor, some of them are people who were put in an impossible position by a man with information they couldn't afford to have public." A pause. "I think you should hear them out before you decide." Victor said, "I intend to." He looked out the window at the Gary industrial corridor moving past in the dark. "Get the 4 committed ones off the street, quietly. The 11, reach out, tonight. From me, by name. Tell them what I know, tell them what Nathan had on them, and tell them that the information Nathan was using is now in my possession, and its disposition is going to depend on what they do in the next 6 hours. "That's a mercy I wouldn't have expected," Dominic said. "Not criticism, observation." "It's not mercy," Victor said. "It's accuracy. Nathan manufactured fear and used it as a construction material. I'm not going to punish people for being afraid of a man who was very good at making people afraid." A pause. "I'm going to punish the people who chose it. That's a smaller number." The vehicle moved north through the dark toward Chicago. The Kinsley Hotel in River North had the particular ambient quality of expensive Chicago hotels at 4 in the morning. Quiet, overlit in the lobby, smelling like carpet cleaner and the trace of someone else's evening. Victor's agent was in a chair near the elevator bank, reading something on his phone with the studied casualness of a man who had been trained to look like he wasn't watching anything. Victor went up alone. Room 1407. He knocked. He heard movement inside. The specific sound of someone who had been awake or who hadn't slept, sitting up and crossing a floor. The door opened. Richard Calloway was 7 years younger than Victor and had always looked it, a lighter version of the same architecture. Their father's eyes and a face that had inherited less of the weight that Victor's face had accumulated. He was in a shirt and slacks, no jacket, and he had clearly not slept. His eyes were red at the edges and his hair was not right, and he looked standing in the hotel room doorway with his older brother in front of him at 4 in the morning, like someone had removed the floor from beneath him, and he was still in the process of falling. He said, "Victor." Victor said, "Let me in." Richard stepped back. Victor came in. He looked at the room, neat, barely inhabited, a laptop on the desk, and a phone face down beside it, a window showing the north side lit against the dark. The window was the same Chicago he'd been looking at all night through different glass. He sat in the desk chair. Richard sat on the edge of the bed. They looked at each other. Victor said, How much did Nathan tell you about what he was doing? Richard said, he told me he was restructuring the financial architecture of the organization, that you'd asked him to find ways to. He told you I authorized it. He said it was at your direction, that you wanted the money moved through legitimate structures I could provide access to, that it was modernization. Richard's voice had the quality of someone reciting words that they are simultaneously hearing differently than they have ever heard them before. He said you didn't want direct involvement because of the legal exposure. Richard, I know, Richard said. I know how it sounds. Do you know what he used that money for? I'm starting to. His voice cracked on the last word. A small fracture, quickly controlled. I've been sitting in this room since 10 o'clock tonight trying to... He stopped. He pressed his hand flat against his knee. I got a call from someone in the organization, someone I didn't know. They told me Nathan was being investigated, that there had been an attempt on your life, that a woman was in the hospital. He looked at Victor. I didn't know about any of it. Victor. The bomb. The woman. I did not know. Victor looked at his brother. He looked at him the way you look at someone when the question is not what they're saying, but what the truth is beneath it. And the particular difficulty of this moment was that the evidence of the 4-year financial thread was real, and Richard's shock was also real. And both things could be true simultaneously, which was the most exhausting category of situation a man could find himself in at 4:17 in the morning after the longest night of his life. He said, the money you moved, the structures you provided access to, do you understand what Nathan used them for? To fund the people he was bringing against you. Among other things, Victor leaned forward. Richard, look at me. Richard looked at him. Nathan was going to let me die in my own vehicle, and then he was going to take everything, and the financial architecture you built for him, the structures, the access, the clean movement of resources, was the foundation he built it on. Victor's voice stayed even. He kept it even the way you keep a vehicle on a road in ice, constant adjustment, constant attention, the discipline of not allowing the slide to start. Whether or not you knew what it was for, you built it. Richard's face did something complicated and painful. He said, what do you need from me? Not, what happens to me now? Not, am I in trouble? Not a self-protective question. What do you need from me? Victor sat with that for 3 seconds. He said, everything, every transaction, every structure, every communication with Nathan over 4 years. Everything documented, everything preserved, everything organized in a format that I can use. He stood up. And then you stay in this room, with my people outside the door, until I decide how to handle the rest of it. Are you going to eat? I don't know yet, Victor said. I'm telling you the truth, which is more than Nathan gave you. He moved toward the door. Richard said, Victor. He stopped. The woman, Richard said. The housekeeper. Is she going to be okay? Victor stood with his hand on the doorframe. He said, I'm going to make sure of it. He walked out into the corridor and his phone buzzed simultaneously with 2 messages. Dominic reporting that 3 of the 4 committed conspirators were in custody, and an unknown number sending a single-frame video clip that showed, in the grainy green wash of a night vision feed, the exterior of a building that Victor recognized immediately. The Callaway Tower. The timestamp on the clip was 4:22 a.m. Current. The clip was 11 seconds long. In it, 4 men moved through the tower's service entrance with the coordinated efficiency of people who had practiced the approach. Victor watched the clip twice. He knew 2 of the 4 men. He did not know where Cho was. He looked at the tower in the video, and he looked at the timestamp, and he looked at the remaining name on the committed list. The 4th one, the one Dominic had not yet reported as contained. And he understood, with the clarity that comes at the end of a long night, when everything peripheral has been stripped away, and only the essential remains, that Nathan Hayes had not been sitting in the 14th floor conference room waiting. Nathan had been stalling. The 2 a.m. meeting, the information he'd given up, the calculated candor about Richard and the coerced 11. All of it had been the performance of a man buying time for something already in motion, something that was now arriving at the tower while Victor was in River North, and his operational team was scattered across 3 locations, and the sky was beginning at its very eastern edge to consider Sedosa, with me. And they were through the lobby doors and into the River North night before the sentence was finished. The drive to the tower was 9 minutes. Victor made it in 7, in the passenger seat of his agent's vehicle, with his hand braced against the dash, and the city blurring past in the particular amber and shadow palette of a Chicago pre-dawn. That hour when the night shift hasn't ended and the morning hasn't started, and the streets belong to no one and everyone simultaneously. He used the 9 minutes, 7 minutes, to think. Nathan had stalled. The meeting, the confessions, the careful rationing of information, all of it had been the performance of a man keeping Victor occupied while a second operation moved into position, which meant Nathan had planned for the possibility that Victor would survive the bomb, survive the hospital play, make it to the tower, and extract the confession. Nathan had planned for Victor being smart enough to get this far. The question was whether Nathan had also planned for what came after. For Victor being back in a vehicle at 4:30 in the morning, moving toward the tower with everything Nathan had said still fresh and sharp and organized in his mind. Victor thought about the 4 men in the service entrance clip. He thought about Cho, still unlocated, still active. He thought about the 14th floor conference room and what Nathan would have done in the 90 minutes since Victor walked out of it. He thought about the building's architecture, 42 floors, multiple stairwells, the executive elevator that required a key, the secondary systems on the 14th floor that could operate independently. He thought about what Nathan actually wanted, stripped of the conspiracy framing and the organizational language. What a man wants when he has spent 18 months building towards something and then watches it fail in real time is not necessarily to escape. Sometimes it is. Sometimes the thing a man wants, when everything has come apart, is to ensure that what he built does not survive him. Victor said, "Dominic, when you get to the lobby, pull the building's fire suppression controls offline." A pause. I know what it is. Do it. Victor, if Nathan triggers the suppression system while people are the building's on skeleton overnight staff, clear the lobby and pull the controls offline. He watched the tower come into view, glass and steel lit against the pre-dawn. His father's name on the facade, 42 floors of everything the old man built and Victor had built after him. Nathan is not going to burn this building down with the suppression controls active. He might burn it down without them, pull them offline so he knows the option is gone. Dominic was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then, done. The lobby was clear when Victor arrived. Dominic had moved the overnight staff to the adjacent parking structure, and 2 of his agents held the entrance with the flat, watchful competence of people who had been doing this long enough to do it without visible effort. Dominic himself was at the security console, where the building's internal camera system showed him the current status of each floor in a grid of small gray images. Victor came through the doors and went directly to the console. He looked at the grid. 14th floor. The conference room was lit, movement visible, at least 3 figures, the camera angle partial and unhelpful in the specific way that Nathan had chosen this room for. He looked for the 4 men from the service entrance. Dominic pointed to the screen showing the building's service corridor on the 11th floor. "They've been stationary for 6 minutes. Waiting. For Nathan's signal. That's my read. And Cho?" Dominic's finger moved to a different screen. Exterior camera, south face of the building. A shadow at the base of the building that could have been anything, except that it had moved twice in the last 3 minutes in a direction that ruled out wind and everything else except a person who was being extremely careful. "He came back to the building," Victor said. "He came back to the building," Dominic confirmed. Which means either Nathan called him back or Cho decided on his own that the job isn't finished. Victor thought about what Marcus had said in the Gary warehouse. Nathan used everyone. He thought about the calibration of the dosage in Emily's IV line. Slow, designed to look like complications, designed to be deniable. That was not improvised. That was Cho's professional signature. And a man with that signature did not abandon assignments because the operational environment had become complicated. Cho was here because Emily was no longer here, and he knew it, and he was here for the next available target. Victor said, "Who knows I'm in this building right now?" Dominic said, "Everyone in this lobby. Nathan, if he's watching the exterior cameras, he still has access to the building systems from the 14th floor." A pause. "Cho, if Nathan told him, then we use it," Victor said. He looked at the agent nearest the elevator. "I'm going up. Alone, in the executive elevator. visible on every camera in the system. He looked at Dominic. When I'm in the elevator, move on the 4 men in the service corridor, quietly. I don't want Nathan hearing anything that tells him his backup is gone before I'm in that room. Dominic said, And Cho? Cho is yours. The moment I'm in the elevator, take him, whatever it takes. Alive? Victor looked at the shadow on the exterior camera. He thought about a maintenance ledge 14 inches wide. He thought about a thin secondary line inserted into an IV port with the precision of someone who had done it before and would do it again without losing sleep. He said, Alive if it's possible. Dominic nodded once. Victor straightened his jacket. He looked at the cut above his eyebrow in the black reflection of the console screen. It had stopped bleeding sometime in the last hour, dried dark against his skin, a line that would leave a mark for a week. His jacket had not improved. He looked, by any objective measure, like a man who had been through a very bad night. He pressed the button for the executive elevator. He got in. 42 seconds to the 14th floor. He counted them. At 20 seconds, he heard, faint through the elevator shaft, the sound of something that was not quite a shout. Controlled, compressed. The sound of a physical confrontation being managed by professionals who had been told to keep it quiet. The service corridor. Dominic's team moving on the 4 men. At 31 seconds, his phone buzzed. Single word from Dominic, clear. At 42 seconds, the elevator opened onto the 14th floor corridor, and Victor walked out into the full brightness of the lights that had never been reset, and he walked toward the conference room at the end of the hall, and he did not slow down, and he did not stop. He opened the door. Nathan was standing at the window. He was standing exactly where Victor had been standing earlier in the night, at the tower glass, looking out at the city, hands clasped behind his back. And the mirror quality of it was not accidental. Nathan was a deliberate man. Everything he did was placed. 2 men flanked him. Victor recognized one, the 4th committed conspirator from Dominic's list, a logistics coordinator named Briggs, who had been with the organization for 6 years and who Victor now understood had not been coerced. The other was a face Victor didn't know, which told him this was someone Nathan had brought in from outside, which told him in turn that Nathan had understood the coercion strategy was a ceiling, that beyond a certain point, you needed people whose loyalty was purchased rather than leveraged. Briggs had a weapon visible. The unknown man did not show one, which was more concerning. Nathan turned from the window. He looked at Victor, at the cut, the jacket, the general condition of a man who had traveled very far through a very long night, and his expression did something that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction. Something in between. The expression of a chess player watching an opponent make a move that was not the move that was expected, but that could still be managed. He said, "You came back." Victor said, "Where's Cho?" Something moved in Nathan's face. A recalculation. Victor said, "He's not coming. Your 4 men in the service corridor aren't coming either." He came fully into the room. He did not look at Briggs or the unknown man. He kept his eyes on Nathan. "It's just us. Same as it was 2 hours ago, except now you've had time to think about what's available to you, and you've concluded that this room is where it ends, so let's end it." Nathan said, "You should have stayed in River North. You needed me here. I needed you away from... You needed me in this building," Victor said, "because the play you're making right now, whatever it is, requires me present. A coup with the principal absent is a story. A coup with the principal in the building is a statement." He stopped 10 feet from Nathan. "What statement were you planning to make?" Nathan looked at him for a long moment. The city was gray going to blue behind him, the first dilution of night that means morning is coming whether or not you're ready for it. He said, "Sit down, Victor." "No, I'm asking you to... I heard you the first time." Victor's voice was not loud. It had the quality it had arrived at sometime around 2 in the morning after the conference room in Gary and Richard's hotel room, stripped of everything except what was necessary, the way a piece of metal is stripped when it has been in fire long enough. "I came up here alone. My people have the building. Cho is contained. You have 2 men and a window. Tell me what you actually want." Nathan was quiet for 10 seconds. Then he sat down. He sat in the chair at the head of the table. The same chair, the same position. And he folded his hands on the table in front of him, and he looked at Victor with an expression that had finally relinquished the last of its performance layers. What was underneath was not what Victor expected. It was tired. Simply, deeply tired. The face of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and has arrived, through the wreckage of a night that went wrong in every direction, at the particular relief of having nothing left to carry. He said, "The Harmon situation 2 years ago." Victor said, "What about it?" "The 3 people you lost. I didn't tell Nathan about them." He said it looking directly at Victor, with the specificity of someone correcting a record that matters. "I know what you thought in that conference room when you saw my name on his phone. I know what you concluded. You were wrong about the sequence." Victor said, "Explain." "Nathan had the information before he came to me. He had it from someone inside the organization who has been gone for 18 months, a man named Ferraro, who you terminated for unrelated reasons, and who was, in fact, feeding Nathan long before either of us knew Nathan was a problem." Nathan's hand stayed flat on the table. "Nathan came to me with the Harmon information already in his possession. He didn't need me to give it to him. He needed me to confirm it, to validate what he had, so that he could use it without the risk of acting on false intelligence. And you confirmed it." "I confirmed it because he told me it was for an internal audit, a loyalty assessment. He said you had authorized it." The room was very quiet. Victor said, "He used the same line on you that he used on Richard." "He's consistent," Nathan said. I'll give him that." "When did you know?" 8 months ago. I found something in the financial records that didn't align with what Nathan had told me. I started looking." He paused. "By then it was too late to come to you. I had confirmed the Harmon information. I had provided access to 2 other pieces of intelligence that Nathan had used in ways I hadn't sanctioned. Coming to you meant confessing to things that I could not explain in a way that would sound like anything other than what they looked like." "So you went silent." "I went silent, and I tried to manage him, to limit what he could do." Nathan's jaw tightened. "I was wrong about that too. You cannot limit a man like Nathan by staying adjacent to him. You either stop him or you become him." Victor looked at him for a long time. He said, "Briggs." The logistics coordinator, who had been standing at Nathan's right for the last 4 minutes with a weapon and the rigid posture of a man who is less certain about his position than he appeared when the evening began, looked at Victor. Victor said, "Put it down." Briggs looked at Nathan. Nathan said, "Put it down, Briggs." Briggs put it down. The unknown man at Nathan's left had not moved through any of this. Victor looked at him now, directly, without the careful peripheral awareness he'd been maintaining. The man was younger than he'd seemed from the doorway, early 30s, professional stillness. He met Victor's gaze without the aggression of someone spoiling for a confrontation and without the vacancy of someone who was simply executing instructions. Victor said, "Who are you?" The man said, "My name is Reeves. I'm a federal investigator. I've been embedded in Nathan Hayes' network for 14 months. He reached into his jacket. Slowly, with the exaggerated care of someone in a room with armed people who are already at their limits, and produced a credential wallet, which he opened and held out. Victor looked at it. He looked at Nathan. Nathan said, "I made a decision 6 months ago. When I understood I couldn't manage Nathan from inside, I found another way to stop him." He held Victor's gaze. "I went to people who had the authority to do what I couldn't do alone." The federal credential in Reeves's hand was real. Victor had seen enough real ones to know. He looked at it for 3 seconds, and then he looked at Reeves and he said, 14 months. 14 months, Reeves confirmed. Nathan Hayes has been under active federal investigation for criminal conspiracy, financial fraud, and attempted murder. As of tonight, with the evidence collected and the testimony of multiple witnesses, we have what we need. He paused. We've been waiting for an operational moment that would allow us to move without compromising the investigation or creating a public incident. Tonight is that moment, Victor said. Tonight is that moment. Victor stood in the center of the 14th floor conference room of the Callaway Tower at 4:51 in the morning, and he looked at the federal credential, and he looked at Nathan, and he looked at the city going gray-blue through the window, and he understood. With the slow, total comprehension of a man receiving information that reorganizes everything around it, that the night had not ended the way he expected because it had not been, entirely, his night to end. He said to Nathan, "You could have told me." Nathan said, "No, I couldn't. You could have Victor. Nathan's voice was quiet. If I had come to you 8 months ago with what I had, partial information, my own complicity, a federal contact I'd made without your knowledge, what would you have done? Victor didn't answer, because the answer was not the one that reflected well on him, and they both knew it, and Nathan saying it aloud wasn't cruelty. It was the same stripped-down accuracy that the whole night had been moving toward. Nathan said, "You would have handled it, the way you handle things." A pause. Reeves and his team would have lost 14 months of work. Nathan would have gone to ground, and the federal case, the one that takes him away permanently, legally, in a way that can't be undone or appealed or reversed by anyone with enough money, would not exist. Victor said, "And the bomb." I didn't know about the bomb until Marcus moved. I knew Nathan was building toward something. I didn't know the timeline or the method until that morning. Nathan looked at his hands. I told Reeves at 6 a.m. Reeves was coordinating a response when Emily Parker walked into your foyer and made it irrelevant. The room absorbed that. Victor sat down. He sat in the chair across from Nathan, the same chair he'd sat in 2 hours ago, on the other side of the same conversation. And he put his elbows on the table and he pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for 3 seconds, which was the closest he had come all night to acknowledging what the last 23 hours had cost him. Then he took his hands down. He looked at Reeves. He said, "What do you need from me?" The formal process took 4 hours. Reeves made calls. Reeves's colleagues arrived, 3 of them, in vehicles that parked in the tower's underground structure rather than at the curb, which was a courtesy Victor noted and did not comment on. Documents were signed. Recordings were transferred, including the 47-minute recording Victor had made in the Gary warehouse, which Reeves received with the expression of someone who has just been handed something they needed and had not expected to have. Nathan Hayes was taken from the building at 6:15. He walked out with Reeves on one side and a federal colleague on the other, and he walked without being held. His own feet, his own pace, his own decision to move, and he did not look back at the tower as he went, which was either dignity or denial, and Victor decided, watching through the lobby window, that it didn't matter which. Marcus Reed was taken from Gary by a separate federal team at 6:40. Tyler Brooks, who had been in the secondary location since the previous evening, was transferred to federal custody at 7. The 4 committed conspirators were processed through the same channels before 8. The 11 coerced were handled differently. Each of them received a phone call from Victor personally because he had said he would do it personally, and he did it personally, sitting in the tower lobby with a cup of coffee that was better than the hospital vending machines and worse than anything he would normally accept, working through the list one by one as the morning came up outside. The calls were short. He told each of them what he knew, what the federal case meant, and what their cooperation with the investigation would determine about their continued roles. He did not threaten. He did not perform generosity. He stated the facts and let them arrive at their own conclusions. 11 calls. 11 people who had been frightened by a man who was very good at finding fear and using it. All 11 cooperated. He drove to Evanston at 9 in the morning. Dominic's brother-in-law, a quiet man named Gerald, who had the unassuming competence of someone who had been good at his work for 30 years without needing anyone to know it, met Victor in the clinic's small parking lot and walked him through what the night had produced medically. The sedative compound had been fully cleared from Emily's system by 3 a.m. The original injuries, the blunt force trauma from the alley, the laceration, the 2 cracked ribs, were serious but not permanent. She had regained partial consciousness at 7:15. She had asked for water. She had asked what time it was. She had asked if Victor knew. Gerald relayed this last part with the careful neutrality of a man who understood he was operating at the edge of information he'd agreed not to have, and Victor received it with a nod and followed Gerald into the clinic. The room was small and clean and smelled like antiseptic and the particular stillness of a space that has been maintained by people who care about what they're doing. Morning light came through a single window. Real light now, the full light of a Chicago morning that had decided to be clear after the rain, the kind of light that makes the city look like it was built that way. Emily was awake. She was propped at a slight incline on the bed with an IV line in her left arm. A clean one, Victor noted, the straightforward kind. And her face was a document of what the previous day had cost her. The bruising had deepened overnight in the way bruising does, darker, more fully realized, and the swelling on the left side had shifted and settled. The laceration at her collarbone was closed and dressed. She looked like someone who had been through something serious and was on the other side of it and knew it. Her eyes, when Victor came through the door, were clear. She watched him cross the room. She watched him sit in the chair beside the bed. The same configuration as the hospital, the same relative positions, as if the night had arranged itself in a circle and brought them back to this. He sat. He looked at her. She said, "You look terrible." He said, "I've been told." She looked at the cut above his eyebrow. She looked at his jacket. She said, "Did you sleep?" "No." "Is it over?" He thought about how to answer that, about Nathan and Reeves and the federal case, and Richard sitting in a River North hotel room with a laptop and 4 years of financial documentation, and Marcus in federal custody, and Cho, who had been taken outside the tower's south face by Dominic's people at 4:38 with a broken wrist and a profound reluctance to say anything that Reeves's colleagues had been patiently working on since 5 a.m. He said, "It's over." Emily let out a breath. It was a long breath, the kind that has been held for a significant period of time and is finally, carefully, released. Her eyes went to the window. She looked at the light on the buildings visible beyond the glass. Then she looked back at him. She said, "The laundry was going to need to be run again. There was a load in the machine when I left." Victor looked at her. She said, "I'm not being serious. I know the laundry is not the issue right now." "No," he said, "it's not. I just—" She stopped. She looked at her hands. The right one, the one that had held the fabric, was unbandaged now, and he could see a faint bruising across the knuckles from where she had apparently grabbed something and held it. "I keep thinking about ordinary things. It's what my brain wants to do. Go back to ordinary." Victor said, "That's not where you're going." She looked at him. He said, "The medical costs are handled. All of them. There's going to be an account established in your name, but not a salary, not a severance. Compensation. For what you did and what it cost you." He said it the way he said things he had decided. Flatly, finally, without invitation for negotiation. "Your family is going to be looked after. Your mother, your brother. That's already in motion. Your apartment, the lease situation, the building issues, all of it handled." Emily was quiet. He said, "You're not going back to the mansion." She said, "I figured. Not because there's any question about what you did. Because you deserve something better than scrubbing floors for a man who didn't bother to see you for 3 years." The room was quiet for a moment. Emily said, "You did eventually. At the cost of nearly getting you killed. I made choices that contributed to the nearly getting killed part," she said. "I knew what I was walking into when I stopped you in the foyer. Not the full picture, but enough." She looked at him directly. "I'm not fragile, Mr. Calloway. I'm injured. Those are different things." He looked at her, at the bruised face and the clear eyes, and the quality in her that he had finally identified and could not unidentify. The thing that was not courage exactly, or not only courage, but something that sat below courage. A person who looks at a situation and does the thing that needs doing without requiring the situation to be easy first. He said, "I know." She said, "What happens now, for you?" He thought about that. He thought about Nathan in federal custody, and the case that would take years to fully resolve, and Richard who had agreed in a hotel room at 4 in the morning to do what was necessary to clean up what he'd been used to build, and the 11 people who had been frightened into something they hadn't chosen and who were now choosing differently. He thought about the organization, his father's foundation, his own 17 years of building, and the work of assessing what remained, what had been compromised, what could be trusted, and what needed to be rebuilt from different materials. He said, "The same thing that always happens, the work. Will it be different?" He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. He said, "Some of it." She nodded. She looked at the window again. She said, "The city looks different at this time of day. When you've been up all night and then the morning comes, everything looks—" She paused, searching for the word. "Temporary, like it could all shift." "It could," Victor said. "It does." "Is that supposed to be comforting?" "It's supposed to be true," he said. "Comforting is a different request." She almost smiled. It moved carefully across the bruised topography of her face and landed somewhere that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood, the expression of someone who has retained the capacity for it, despite significant recent evidence that the world does not always reward it. She said, "Thank you." He said, "I owe you considerably more than gratitude. You don't owe me anything." She said it without aggression, just clearly, with the same directness she'd had in the foyer when she stepped into his path and changed the direction of everything. "I made a choice. I'd make it again. That's not a transaction." Victor looked at her for a moment. He said, "I know that too." He stood up. He straightened his jacket, which had long since passed the point where straightening it made any visible difference. He looked at the morning through the window, the clear light, the city going about its business 40 feet below, entirely unaware of what the night had cost to keep it exactly as it was. He said, "Someone will be outside this room until you're discharged. After that, there will be a security arrangement. Not intrusive, not permanent, but necessary for a while. You'll be consulted on what it looks like." He moved toward the door. "Gerald will have my direct number. If you need anything, you call." Emily said, "Mr. Calloway." He stopped at the door. She said, "You should sleep." He said, "I will." He went out into the corridor and closed the door behind him and stood in the quiet of Gerald's small clinic for a moment, with the morning coming through the skylight above the reception desk, and he let himself feel the weight of the night in full, every hour of it, every decision, every piece of what he had learned about the people around him and about himself, the complete accounting of what trust costs when it is misplaced and what it is worth when it is not. He felt it. He didn't perform it or manage it. He stood in the corridor of a small clinic in Evanston and let it sit on him for 30 seconds. Then he called Dominic. Dominic said, "How is she?" Victor said, "Awake, clear, she's going to be fine." He started walking toward the exit. "Where are we?" Dominic ran through it. Cho had provided a full accounting to Reeves's team by 8 a.m., including 3 external contacts that the federal case had not previously identified. The financial documentation Richard was assembling had already produced 2 discoveries that Reeves described, according to Dominic, as significant. The 11 coerced members of the organization were cooperating across the board. The 4 committed conspirators were in federal custody. Marcus Reed had asked, through his attorney, to speak with Victor directly. Victor said, "No." "Understood." "Not yet," Victor corrected. "Not until the federal process has what it needs from him. After that, maybe. Depending." He pushed through the clinic's front door into the morning. "And Richard?" "Still at the hotel, still working. He called me at 8 to ask if there was anything specific you needed prioritized." Victor stopped on the clinic steps. The morning air was cold and clean after the rain, the particular sharpness of a Chicago morning that has decided to be honest about what it is. He breathed it in. One full breath, the first one in hours that wasn't measured against what needed to happen next. He said, "Tell him to get some sleep first." Dominic said, "He's not going to." "Tell him anyway," Victor said. "Tell him I said." A pause. Something in Dominic's voice when he said, "I'll tell him," a quality that had not been in it during the operational hours of the night, when every word was functional and nothing was carried beyond its function. Something that was not quite warm, but was adjacent to it. The specific tone of a man who has worked for someone through a very bad night and come out the other side and recognized, in the morning, what that means. Victor drove back toward the city alone. He drove on the expressway with the morning traffic beginning to build around him. The ordinary machinery of the city returning to itself, commuters and delivery trucks, and the particular democratic flow of a major American city that does not stop for any one person's catastrophe, that absorbs everything and continues, which is either its cruelty or its mercy, depending on where you're standing. He drove and he thought about Emily Parker saying, "I made a choice. I'd make it again. That's not a transaction." He thought about what it meant to be seen for what you actually are. Not what you present, not what your position requires, but what you are underneath in the moments when the performance layer is gone and only the person remains. He thought about how rarely that happened, in his particular world, and how much of what he had constructed over 17 years was designed to make it less likely rather than more. He thought about a woman who had worked in his house for 3 years and who had seen something in him. In that phone call with his sister, in whatever other accumulated moments her quiet observation had catalogued, that was worth risking her life for. He thought about what it meant that he had not known she was there, not the operational failure of it, the security implication of an employee who moved through your space undetected, but the human one, the simple fact of a person who was present every day and invisible, and the choice, which had not been conscious, to keep her that way. He thought about how many other choices like that he had made, how many other people. The expressway carried him south toward the city's center, toward the tower with his father's name on it and the 14th floor that would need to be reassessed, and the organization that would need, in the weeks and months ahead, to be rebuilt in the places where it had been compromised. Toward the work, the same work, and in some ways that he was only beginning to understand, different work. He thought about Nathan's voice saying, "You're sentimental," and his own voice saying, "I was." He had said it as an acknowledgement of past error. He was not certain, this morning, that it was an error. He was not certain that the capacity to be moved by things, by a woman who cleaned your floors, choosing to save your life, by a brother who had been used and who had asked not what happens to me, but what do you need, was the liability he had always treated it as. He was not certain. He was willing, for the first time in a long time, to sit with the uncertainty. The city came up around him as he exited the expressway. The glass and stone and the particular smell of Chicago in the morning, the lake cold and present somewhere east of everything, orienting the city the way it always had. He drove through it toward whatever came next. He drove through it and he let himself arrive. 3 weeks later, Emily Parker walked out of Gerald's clinic on her own 2 feet, into a morning that was colder than the one she had woken up in, with winter moving seriously down from the north in the way Chicago winters do. Not a gradual transition, but a decision, the weather making up its mind. She stood on the clinic steps with a jacket that Victor's assistant had arranged, and a phone that had her mother's number already in it, and she looked at the street. A car was waiting, not armored, not conspicuous, a clean gray sedan with a driver who introduced himself as Frank and who asked her, once she was in, whether she wanted the heat on or off. She said, "On." Frank turned the heat on. She looked out the window as the city moved past. She had grown up in this city. She had cleaned its buildings and taken its buses and carried its weather in her body for 31 years. It looked the same from the outside, glass and stone and the compressed urgency of a place that does not wait for you. It felt different from the inside. She was not sure yet whether that was the city or herself, and she thought that was probably the right question to be unable to answer, for now. Her phone rang. The number was Victor's direct line, which she had used exactly once, a test call, at Gerald's suggestion, to confirm it was working. She answered. Victor said, "How do you feel?" She said, "Functional?" That's not an answer. It's the most accurate one I have right now. A pause. She could hear faintly the ambient sound of his office, the tower, probably, the ordinary operations of a city morning conducting themselves around whatever he was working through. He said, "There's a position in organizational operations, not a title that exists yet, not something with a clear precedent, managing the internal culture of the organization, the staff, the structure, how things actually work versus how they're supposed to work." He said it in the way he said things he had decided, but underneath it there was something that was asking a question. It would require knowing things about how this organization operates that most people in it don't know. It would require a specific kind of seeing. Emily said, "I've been doing that for 3 years." "I know," Victor said. "I'm asking if you want to be paid for it." She looked out the window. Chicago moved past, familiar and strange, the same city and a different one. She thought about what it meant to be offered a place in a world that had almost killed her, and whether that was the irony it sounded like, or whether it was something more complicated than irony. She thought about what she had said to Victor in the clinic room. "I'd make it again." She had meant it. She still meant it. Not because the choice had been easy, or because the cost had been acceptable, or because she had any interest in pretending that nearly dying was something other than what it was, but because a choice made from the right place, from the part of a person that has not been defeated by fear or exhaustion or the particular arithmetic of self-preservation, does not stop being the right choice because it was hard. She said, "I have conditions." Victor said, "Name them." She named them. He listened. He agreed to two without discussion, pushed back on one with a counterargument that was reasonable enough that she amended it rather than held it, and said nothing about the fourth for long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "The fourth one is fine." She said, "Just like that. You said you're not fragile. I'm taking you at your word." She looked at the city. She said, "All right." He said, "All right." The call ended. Frank drove. Chicago opened up in front of them, the lake appearing as they crested a rise, gray and enormous and present. The thing that had always been there at the edge of the city's consciousness, orienting everything whether or not you chose to look at it. Emily looked at it. She looked at it for a long time. The woman who everyone had overlooked, the invisible one, the one who noticed things precisely because no one thought to notice her, sat in a clean gray sedan on a cold Chicago morning and looked at the lake and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has come through something at significant cost and arrived somewhere real on the other side, that her life had not changed because of what Victor Calloway had decided to give her. It had changed because of what she had decided to do. That was a different thing. It was the most important thing. And she held it the way she had held the torn piece of fabric in the hospital, tightly, deliberately, with the full intention of not letting go. The car moved through the city. The lake stayed where it always was. Chicago went on.